My name is Julie Rosa. Welcome, everybody. I'm the First Amendment specialist here at Iowa State University, and this session that you're joining us on is part of our annual First Amendment Days celebration. So this is our 20th year of celebrating and educating about the First Amendment. We're ending a terrific week with a series of virtual workshops on contemporary issues related to the First Amendment. So this session, I promise you, will be a enlightening discussion about all issues related to the First Amendment, in particular, censorship, and even more in particular as it relates to our campuses. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my friend Andrea here to kind of host this discussion. I do want to thank you all for being here. A couple of quick announcements. We will end right at 12:50. So that we can get on to our other activities for the day. The session is being recorded. Please don't wait to ask your questions until the end of the session, but instead drop those in the chat as we go along so that we can be sure to answer those. And so with that, on that note, Andrea, take it away.
Thank you, Julie. I am honored to be asked again to come back and help be a part of Iowa State's longstanding tradition of celebrating the First Amendment. Iowa State is super lucky to have Julie at the helm with all of that, but it also has had a longstanding history led by Mark Witherspoon and others. And I just want to say it feels like a little bit like coming home, of course, every time I go to back to work for Iowa State University on this front. This is where I kind of got started. So those of you who are joining us right now, you have opted in for a session that we're calling "When Control is the Goal, Stop the Process." And "Stop the Process" has an exclamation mark behind it for a very real reason. I am very honored to have the opportunity to lead this Q&A with Lindsie Rank, who is the student press counsel for FIRE. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with FIRE, FIRE is an acronym. It stands for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And I just want to get started. I could give you a great big long bio for Lindsie, but I actually think that sometimes it's a better move to sort of throw it to the expert in the room and ask her to privilege what she thinks is important here. I am interested in asking you, Lindsie, just to begin with, to highlight a little bit about what you think is important for us to know, both about FIRE, because I suspect that there are plenty of people in the session right now who aren't super familiar with FIRE. I know it as a leader in the nation for advocacy for student, especially free press and free speech issues. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about FIRE and then also talk a little bit about your own background and what sort of brought you into this field.
Yeah, sure. So FIRE is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We do national work on college campuses related to free expression rights of students and faculty. So we do a lot of advocacy work. We have a small litigation department. So we actually sometimes sue colleges and universities when there are First Amendment issues that pop up. We also do policy reform, legislative advocacy. So a lot of just we have a lot of tools in our toolkit that we use to advocate for expressive rights on campus. I, as our student press counsel, run our Student Press Freedom Initiative, which is a new initiative that we launched a few months ago now, where we are really focused on not only helping student journalists on college campuses with their rights and doing that sort of advocacy work that we've always done, and we've always taken student press cases, but also helping to educate student journalists about their legal responsibilities. Like, how do you avoid ending up in the courtroom? How do you navigate copyright law or defamation law? So a lot of my job, my job is sort of, 30% advocacy, 30% education, and 30% I also do research. And this, I guess, sort of gets into your other question about how did I end up in this field?
Yeah.
So I was a student journalist in high school and college, and I unfortunately had some run-ins with administrators. And, I think a lot of former student journalists have war stories about the story that they weren't allowed to publish or the story that they just got a lot of pushback on. And I knew I didn't want to be a journalist. I tell students all the time that I love journalism, but every time I pick up the phone to call a source, I have a panic attack. I realized that was not a way to live my life for the rest of my life.
I have so many students who tell me that, by the way. So yes, I get it.
Right. So I, was trying to explore what else can I do sort of in this field. And I was taking a media law class in my my undergrad, because it was required for all journalism majors. And I loved it. Like, I think I got 100% in that class, which I'm not like the person who gets 100% in every class, just because I thought it was so interesting. And my professor pulled me aside and was like, you could do this for a living. So I ended up going to the University of North Carolina, and I got my law degree, but I also at the same time got a master's in mass communication. So I have a research background. So the other, like I was saying, the other 30% of my job probably is doing research related to control of college media. What does censorship in college media look like? What do student rights in college media look like? So those are sort of the three focuses of the Student Press Freedom Initiative: is advocacy, education, and research.
Fantastic. And I hope Colin Inhofe heard all of that. He and I just had a conversation about that very same trajectory, professional, and he's in the audience. He's one of my students. So fantastic. So that gives us a great background on what it is you do. And it also positions you really well to be able to talk about, from my perspective, a whole lot of very present, very recent issues, but probably ongoing issues, right? Some of these are long-term issues with respect to student-free press, which is sort of the focus here, but we're going to talk a little bit about speech too. So I want to launch us into talking about press to begin with. So obviously last year's ruling in the Mahanoy area school district versus BL ruling put the Tinker precedent really to the test. And luckily, I think the court landed where it needed to land in terms of free speech. But that was a student free speech issue. Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, as somebody who teaches media law, ultimately, the court really hasn't heard anything recently, at least not at that level, with respect to student free press. I mean, I think we still are looking at cases like Hosty versus Carter, 2005, and Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer, 1988. As probably the most consequential rulings anyway for student-free press. Right. I wonder if you could maybe sort of read the tea leaves for us, Lindsie. I mean, you're at the foreground here with respect to the current court makeup and sort of where we're at in terms of student-free speech, maybe influencing any direction they might go, and what you think we might be able to expect in terms of the coming years with student free press.
Yeah, sure. I think so. Mahanoy, it was, like you're saying, it was the first student speech case we've seen the Supreme Court take in decades. Yeah. And Hazelwood is in 1988 is the last time we saw the Supreme Court think about student press specifically. And Hazelwood is interesting because it applies to K-12 media pretty explicitly, or at least some K-12 media, but there's a lot of asterisks in Hazelwood where we're not really 100% sure how it applies to college media, and courts at the circuit level have really struggled with that question of how much, if at all, does Hazelwood apply in the college context. And even when you're talking about K-12 media, there's some sort of gray area about well, does it apply to all K-12 student media, or does it only apply when there's, more direct school sponsorship? And so, we've seen for the last almost 35, I'm bad at math, but many years, several decades, we've seen,
a while, 35, I think works.
Right. We've seen lower courts really, really struggle with how to apply Hazelwood to cases that don't look exactly like Hazelwood. And I think it would be really interesting to see what the current Supreme Court would do with a student press case, or really with even a student speech case at the higher education level. You know, I think Mahanoy was promising in a lot of ways. You know, we weren't really sure going into it how some of the new justices, you know, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, how they might think about student speech issues, because we had a little bit of information about how they might think about First Amendment issues generally. But, you know, all you have to do is look at Justice Thomas to realize like how justices think about free speech, First Amendment issues generally isn't always how they think about it when it applies to students. Because Justice Thomas, he loves himself, you know, some First Amendment issues, but as soon as you think sometimes.
Yeah,
but,
sometimes, let's clarify that.
But one of the big exceptions for him is, you know, is students. If you start thinking about students, he's like off in some La La Land where the First Amendment does not apply. So I think Mahanoy gave us a little bit of optimism when it comes to how some of the new justices might think about student speech issues, student press issues. And I think especially my inclination is, especially if we saw them take up a case in the higher education context, I think they'd be pretty open to, you know, upholding strong free speech protections for college students. You know, the Reporters Committee, every time a new justice is nominated, does a report on their sort of background on First Amendment and free press issues. And Kavanaugh is pretty, even like before he got to the Supreme Court, he was pretty good on free press issues. Gorsuch was pretty okay, like he had less of a track record. Barrett was sort of a wild card because she just didn't have a lot of track record in this area. So, you know, I'm cautiously optimistic that if they were to get a student press case in front of them, especially if it were at the college level, that we'd see some good precedent. And I'd love to see that, because there's currently a circuit split on Hazelwood and the application of Hazelwood to college media. So the Seventh Circuit in Hosty said that it does apply, but the First Circuit has said it doesn't.
And Hosty's kind of it's not really applicable in some ways, because the nature of the ruling was this sort of strange out for the administrator that really didn't come down on any sort of definitive statement about student free press at the collegiate level.
Well, and they remanded it. So the seventh, that's one thing that I think a lot of people forget about Hosty, is that the Seventh Circuit said Hazelwood could potentially apply in the college setting, but they didn't say it absolutely always applies. And they remanded it back down to the district court to determine the actual application, which didn't ever really happen, because then the legislature passed a new voices law, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, let's talk about new voices. Yeah, let's talk about that. That's a good segue, actually. So honestly, in the absence of clarification from the Supreme Court at this point, state law seems to be kind of where it's landing for both collegiate and, well, yeah, I think all student free press. I really think that it is kind of landing there. So ultimately, if that's where the most promising area lies for recourse for students, let's talk just a little bit about the new voices laws. And I suspect that there are plenty of people in the audience right now who aren't really familiar with the new voices laws. Can you talk a little bit about that, and really what FIRE is doing with respect to new voices?
Sure. So new voices laws, they basically reverse Hazelwood in the states in which these are passed. So Hazelwood created a precedent in which, especially K-12 schools, but maybe, you know, questionably colleges also can regulate student media as long as it's school-sponsored student media, and as long as there's some sort of pedagogical or curricular reason for the regulation. This really restricts the ability of student journalists to determine the content of their publications, because sometimes pedagogical reasons, especially when you're talking about K-12, can look like, well, our students are too immature to read about this really important issue. And so New Voices laws came onto the scene as a way for state legislatures to say, no, we're going to reject, this test that Hazelwood came up with and say that student media has to be student run, that students need to have the ability to determine their own content without regulation or oversight from administrators. I think there are 15 states now that have New Voices laws, all of which apply at the K-12 level, but interestingly, not all of which apply at the college level. So some of them, don't include college journalists at all. And I think in those cases, we're still relying on the idea that Hazelwood really shouldn't be applied at the college level to begin with. But yeah, they're really important. Fire is, we support these laws when it comes to college media. Fire only works in the higher education context. So we don't get involved in this legislation at the K-12 level. But the Student Press Law Center, who are our great friends, are doing, fantastic advocacy work getting these laws passed at both K-12 and college level.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And I know that this isn't necessarily New Voices does deal, if I'm not mistaken, with both free press and free speech, or just free press?
It's usually just free press. So there's other laws like the Cafe Acts, but there's other laws that apply to free speech issues on campus. And Fire is very active in lobbying for those laws in the higher education context. And sometimes those laws will include free press protection. So there's sometimes overlap, but I think most of the time we see them being introduced kind of separately.
Yeah, and I tell my students all the time, I don't believe that you can look at one of the freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment all by itself. They're so inherently connected to one another. You can't have free press without free speech, really. I mean, you can't have freedom of religion without free speech. I mean, they're all interconnected. So yeah, I mean, legally, I think there's a lot of separation that happens, but I think just as we sort of conceptualize all of these, they're inherently connected. So, okay, let's segue just a little bit then. So the AAUP notes that the overall mission of higher education, and obviously that's where I'm coming from, so that's a lot of where my interest lies, is to, and I'm going to read this directly, quote, provide a space for intellectual exploration and debate. That's the whole reason I got into higher education to begin with, right? And yet, as social media allows for, and some would say fosters, misinformation and other political tensions, have encouraged less civility, student journalists, I think, are sort of consequentially facing a lot of maybe even unprecedented amounts of pushback on their of distrust and incivility on their own campuses for what it is they're doing, right? To try to put stories out there that may not always be, perfectly happy and rosy and that sort of stuff. So I'm wondering, how's the current climate leading to efforts to censor or even shut down student pressing university campuses? And what would you recommend, might students be doing or paying attention to where that's concerned?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing more and more pushback against student media. The number of, during COVID, we actually had a little reprieve from the number of newspaper thefts that we were seeing, because in 2019, we saw so many, right? And then there wasn't really any in 2020 or 2021. Well, that's because there weren't print newspapers being put out. There was nothing to steal and, put in the trash bin. But we're already seeing that happen again, just last week at Central Washington University. Some copies of the Observer were taken by administrators and, moved because they didn't want prospective students seeing the front page. So we're seeing that start cropping up again. And I think, sometimes it's administrators, but a lot of times those situations are other students, that they're upset with the content in the publication and therefore, take the stack of newspapers and throw it away. So that's one way that we're seeing it, but we're also seeing like a lot of chatter on social media and in other mediums about what content student newspapers and other student publications publish and what content they don't publish. So we're seeing a lot of, well, I was censored by XYZ student publication, which isn't really like how it works, right? The student publications, student editors, they have the First Amendment right to determine the content of their publication. And if they choose not to publish a certain op-ed or a certain letter to the editor or a certain article, that's not censorship, because they're not a government actor, and they're not even in a quasi-governmental role, like, for example, a private university administration might be. So it's really interesting to me when we see those pop up. We sometimes get case submissions to FIRE from students who are like, the student newspaper didn't accept my op-ed, they are violating my free speech rights, what do I do? And I have to very calmly explain to them, like, that's what you can do is like put it on your own blog, or, you know, submit it to a local paper and see if they want to publish it, or see if there's another publication. You don't have a right to have your stuff published in any specific publication. So we are seeing a lot of that. And I think I counsel student journalists to sort of think about it two ways. One is, you know, when you're getting reader feedback, you know, think about the reader feedback. Is it something that is relevant? Is it something that is actually, you know, worth considering? You know, sometimes if you're getting feedback that like, oh, you're covering too much sports and not enough arts on campus, like that might actually be relevant feedback for you. Like maybe you do need to up your arts coverage, or if people are complaining that you're not covering diversity issues enough, like sometimes there are, you know, reader complaints that can actually be, you know, useful for learning how to reach your audience better. But at the same time, you know, I tell student journalists all the time that if you're not pissing someone off, you're not doing your job as a journalist. Yes. So like people are going to be mad at you, you know, and sometimes, so you really have to think about the feedback that you're getting and think about like, is this actually helpful feedback that we should take into consideration? Or is this just people being pissed off at us for doing our job? And it's really up to, you know, your individual editorial team to determine when one or the other is happening and how much you want to implement your reader feedback.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, going back to the newspaper, thefts, which I mean, that's one really easy way to sort of point to, there's plenty of effort to shut down the press in that particular case. And that would be not prior restraint, but just let's get rid of it after the fact. That happened to me twice as you know, a newspaper advisor. Once the student government president didn't like what was said and went all over campus and stole every last paper, threw it in the garbage, or took it to his dorm room. And he was later caught with like, I don't know, hundreds of papers in his dorm room. Oh yeah, I mean, it happens all the time for sure. I think there's some really interesting, more subtle ways, maybe insidious is a better term here, for shutting down student speech that isn't sort of towing the line of public relations. And I think we've sort of lost sight in our nation, really across the nation. We've lost sight of that line between a free press and public relations, that public relations is now what we want to wrap our arms around constantly because it's bright and shiny. You know, I've seen a lot of examples of university officials going to make an employee of the campus marketing team the advisor to student press. So another way to sort of control what the student press is doing is to move a professional from the field of journalism out of that role of advising and put in somebody who is a marketing specialist, whose area of expertise and or role at the university is to tell the bright, shiny story of the university, right? They couch this in sort of reorganization terms or budget savings terms. I wonder if you could speak to any of that and where you might see that happening and what FIRE recommends in terms of student response to that kind of effort.
Right. Yeah, I've seen this a lot in the last, I think, especially
Yeah.
with COVID. It seems,
Oh,
COVID is like the grand excuse for
everything.
universities. Oh, we have to cut your budget, but it's not because of that, that story that you did on our administration doing XYZ. It's because we are, cutting budgets across the board because COVID, or at a couple of institutions, we've seen administrations just completely cut the student newspaper,
Yeah.
like totally, and say that it's for, budgetary reasons because of COVID, which I don't know. You can only use the COVID excuse so much in my book. But it does, like, legally, it makes it really hard to make a case in those situations. But yeah, we've certainly seen like more marketing professionals being put in an advisory role. And I do want to say, like, it's not always terrible, right? Sometimes we've actually seen it go okay. So I don't want to, like, seem like I'm saying that marketing professionals can never be good student media advisors. I think they can. But it's certainly concerning, because to see a university administration take away a journalism professional as this resource to student journalists and replace it with someone who's maybe just not as experienced in, journalism, that just by itself is a concerning trend. I think that as far as student response, a big thing is education. I always recommend students that, sometimes, I don't know, I want to say like 30% of the time administrations are really being like super nefarious, right? They actually don't want you to publish, they actually don't want you to publish anything critical about the institution. So they'll put into place these roadblocks. But probably 70% of the time, they're just not really thinking about it, or like maybe in the back of their mind they are, but they're not, they're not like explicitly trying to be nefarious. So I think educating both administrators, but also that marketing professional who's just been put in that advisory role about what it means to be a student media advisor. Like, this doesn't mean, I see advisors all the time, and it's a pet peeve of mine saying my newspaper, and I want to be like, it's not your newspaper, it's your student's newspaper.
Yeah.
You're there as an advisor. So educating these marketing professionals who are advisors, that being an advisor means you're in an advisory role. You're not in charge. You're not the editor. You're there to answer questions and to provide resources and to ensure that the students have what they need to do their work. And encouraging them to also get involved with things like the College Media Association, where they can learn from other advisors who are journalism professionals about what their role really should look like. And it's not one of censorship, right? It's not one where they should be calling the shots on content. So I think education is a really big part of this. And that's when we've seen it work out, is when a marketing professional comes in and they say, I don't really know a lot about this, and I'm just really going to be here to make sure you have what you need. But I'm going to be hands off. And I think that's when it works the best.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, interestingly enough, at the university where I teach, were they to put a marketing professional into the role of advisor for the student newspaper here, the lead candidate would be our chief writer for the marketing office currently, with years and years and years of journalism experience. The man knows journalism inside and out, right? The interesting challenge would be, though, in that situation, were the students to ultimately criticize something going on at the university, does that put the advisor then into a very strange conflict of interest situation?
Yes, it does. And that's why it's not, it's not a great thing, but, sometimes we sort of have to make do with what we have. And so it's sort of, it's navigating this and helping, that's why I recommend advisors in general. Like, you really shouldn't know necessarily what all of the content of the publication is going to be until it's published. You know, if students have a specific question and want you to review a specific article or want to ask about, you know, can you help me think through sources for this thing that I'm doing? Like, that's great. That's your role, right? Is to provide answers to those kinds of questions. But you don't necessarily need to, it should be on a need to know basis. And you don't necessarily need to know what everything that's going to be in the publication is going to be, especially if you're, you know, a marketing professional or a PR professional for the university, because you are going to be in a position of trying to figure out whether to serve your duty to the newspaper or your duty to the university.
Absolutely.
I also want to say that, like, students should feel free to reach out to other professionals, right? Your advisor doesn't need to be the only person who you ask these questions. You know, there are probably journalism faculty at your university who would be happy to chat with you about your questions, even if they're not your advisor, or local journalists who would be happy, alumni who would be happy to work with you. I definitely have seen sort of unofficial advisors to student publications. And I think that's another really good way to sort of work in this kind of context if you're put in that situation. You know, obviously call me if you have a legal question. Like, I'm happy to chat with student journalists about those issues. So,
you know, I think there's also a little bit more subtle approach to censorship that I've observed that I'd like you to speak to. So I've seen this especially with Residence Life, but not exclusively with Residence Life, right? Sometimes it's an athletic team. Sometimes it's Residence Life. Sometimes it's other offices on campus that, say, for example, students are doing work study in, or whatever it might be. But they have sort of policies in place, whether they're actually codified written policies or they're just, you're told on your first day of work, here's what you need to know, right? That if the press comes to you and asks you to comment on something, you need to defer all questions to a professional, meaning, you know, the director of Residence Life or your coach. You're not allowed to actually make a comment unless it's somehow vetted, right? Which, from my perspective, is very definitely censorship. It's censoring student free speech, not press in that case. But I wonder if you could speak to what students need to know about their rights in these circumstances.
yeah, absolutely. I think I have described this as one of my personal missions to eradicate these policies, because they drive me nuts, because they are censorship of student speech or of employee speech. And they're also, to me, they're also censorship of press. Frank Lamonti, who used to be the executive director of the Student Press Law Center, describes these policies as censorship by starvation. So you're censoring the student press by starving them of the sources they need to be able to actually cover the goings on campus. Most of the time, maybe not most of the time, often these policies are actually illegal, both at public and private institutions. So at public institutions, public employees, so RAs, you know, other student workers, but even faculty, you know, professional staff, they have a First Amendment right to speak to the media or publicly about issues of public concern, as long as they're doing so in their personal capacities. So, you know, this doesn't usually apply to like the PR person, because that person is almost never going to be really speaking in their personal capacity about issues going on campus. Right. But if you're talking about an RA, like, we don't traditionally think of RAs as speaking on behalf of the university. So when they're talking about even their experiences as an RA or their opinion on policies, you know, on campus, they're really speaking in their personal capacities, and it's often on matters of public concern. We saw this come up a lot with COVID. We see this come up a lot with sexual assault issues, where RAs can't speak out about, you know, their frustrations with policies and procedures related to sexual assault on campus. And that just is a First Amendment violation on public campuses, pure and simple. So we at FIRE, I write letters all the time to universities advising them on this. And again, this sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier, like, 30% of the time the campuses are being nefarious and they're really just trying to censor the press. But 70% of the time, they're just like, well, we're like any other company. And most companies have these kinds of rules. And it's true that a lot of companies have these kinds of rules. And so as soon as they get a letter from me, they go, oh crap, we didn't think about the First Amendment. So we've been really successful actually in helping universities to revise these policies. University of North Carolina revised their policy, University of Virginia, Florida Atlantic University. So we've had a lot of success with helping General Counsel's office revise these policies, and they're usually pretty open to it. I do want to say on private campuses, I won't go into it too much, but a lot of the times these are illegal under the National Labor Relations Act, which allows employees of private companies to speak out to the media about their workplace conditions.
So yeah, let me follow up on that quickly. I'm at a private university, right? And one of the arguments might be made that, you're an employee of the university if you're an RA, for example. You're an employee of the university if you're working work study. That doesn't work for athletes. But as a result, we can control to some degree your access to the press. And I think a lot of people don't understand that that's actually not true.
They can to some degree. It's just they can't to the degree they think they can. So, anytime if someone is talking about like COVID protocols on campus and their opinion about COVID protocols and how that's affected, how they think about their job and what happens when they wake up and have to go to work in the morning, like that is them talking about their workplace conditions, which is considered, protected activity under the National Labor Relations Act.
Right.
And even when they're not talking about workplace conditions, which workplace conditions is a very broad category. And so it actually covers a lot more than people might, initially think. But even if they're not talking about workplace conditions, sometimes, even if the law doesn't protect something, that doesn't mean that it's wise to regulate it, especially at private campuses that sort of tout free speech principles as really important to their campus. If you're going to take that promise seriously, and in many cases the law requires you to take those promises seriously because they can actually constitute contractual obligations, then you have to provide avenues for your employees to be able to speak on issues of public concern.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I noticed that in the chat, we've got a couple of questions from people in the audience. So I'd like to go to, and this is most relevant to what we were just talking about. So I'm just going to go to the last question that was posted and we'll go backwards. Catherine Keeley asks, what can student journalists do when law enforcement takes on these censorship by starvation policies? And I'm wondering a little bit if, Catherine, you might be talking about campus security and or campus police. Or are you talking about city police?
Yes, we've mainly experienced it with campus, I would say.
Right. And are you talking about access to information, say, for example, arrests on campus or sort of Clery Act stuff? What do you have an access issues to?
We've just been told recently, or I've been told recently by law enforcement that it was first that we can only talk to one person in particular, and we're not allowed to talk to anyone else. And then more recently, we've experienced them saying like a certain section of our content production, like they don't accept that and won't talk to us until that is like eliminated.
What? Oh my God. Okay, Lindsie, all yours.
Yeah, so it is important to note that there are some exceptions to the First Amendment application when you're talking about public employees. And one area where courts have been very reluctant to require, less regulation is in law enforcement context, because they do, courts recognize like, well, if there's an ongoing investigation or things like that, then there's a little bit more that these entities, so law enforcement entities, might be able to do to actually restrict the ability of other people to talk to you. but it's not great, like it kind of goes back to what I was just saying, that even if they can do it legally, it doesn't necessarily mean they should do it. And the idea that they won't talk to you because of a specific content that you're publishing in your publication, can you give me a call? I mean, because
you need to have a session.
yeah, because that feels like that's starting to sort of drip into content-based restrictions and them retaliating against you for, content that you're publishing, which it can definitely be a First Amendment issue. So I'd really like to have a deeper conversation with you if you want to give me a ring sometime.
Thank you. Is it cool if I just like send my email to you?
Yeah, I can put in the chat. We have a 24-hour hotline. So
Perfect. Thank you so much.
that's just for student journalists. It rings straight to my phone from 9 to 5. And then after hours, it goes to an answering service who will let me know if it's an urgent matter. So
Awesome. That's great. Lindsie, thank you. And Catherine, good luck and keep pushing, because it seems to me like you are facing some content restrictions, which is not okay. So I'm gonna back up. Charles had a question here in the chat. With the ongoing gutting of local newspapers by hedge funds, which, by the way, we've seen some efforts on that front in Iowa, is there reason to fear that some forces may come to gut student newspapers too? For example, you said some college administrations were already withdrawing their funding of student publications, citing financial constraints. Do you see this as a trend likely to become more widespread?
there are a couple of student publications out there that have been that were previously independent, or that had their funding pulled by administration, that are now being run by some of these media conglomerates. Yeah, I mean, but I don't know how. It'll be interesting to see. I'm not sure. I haven't really thought about this a lot. Whether these media conglomerates will think of student media as a profitable, place to go, or because a lot of these student publications have very, fairly, I mean, there's obviously large student publications, but there's also student publications at tiny schools that don't have huge readership, that I'm not sure how attractive those would be to these media hedge funds, as you call them. So that's really interesting. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I could think of a couple of, maybe a handful of what I would point to as pretty powerful student newspapers, as in they've got a lot of reach in their respective communities. I would argue that the Iowa State Daily is actually one of them.
Yeah.
Iowa State Daily, okay, I'm biased, but is truly one of the best student newspapers in the nation. And it arguably has a huge reach into Ames, particularly given that the Ames Tribune itself has been gutted.
Right.
So I could see some moments where a student publication might be attractive, but I would have a hard time seeing a hedge fund, because I don't know that they could make any real money off of it. And that's
There's at least one in Florida. I'm trying to remember which student publication, but there's at least one in Florida that I want to say is Gannett now. So there is
Really?
some precedent for this, but I haven't seen it take off, which doesn't mean it won't, but I haven't yet seen it take off.
Yeah, and I guess, one of the things we haven't really touched on, but that we might throw out at this point, is the importance of a student press being as independent as it can be. Now, there are lots and lots of schools, my own included, that have a long-standing history of funding the student newspaper, right? It comes out of a budget line, or out of student government funding, or whatever. But I know that SPLC as well as FIRE have always encouraged students to think about, how can you go independent? How can you subsist on, really robust advertising sales and or grants or whatever, so that you're not sort of beholden to funding by the university as a means of sort of getting away from any sort of content management.
Right. Although that's getting harder and harder.
It is becoming harder
for
for
student
sure.
publications to subsist on advertising.
I mean, it's harder and harder for professional organizations. I mean,
I think we're seeing more of, and I think we're starting to recommend more of a organizational structural independence that doesn't necessarily require complete financial independence, because when it comes to finances, it's a lot easier to come in and advocate that, like, no, you can't just take away this funding because you didn't like, this article. But when it comes to structure, it's really hard to identify the ways in which structural dependence, so we're talking about things like, actually being in, under an academic department or under the student life department. It's harder to identify ways in which that creates a censorial environment. But we're actually working right now on a 4-year research study where we're looking at different structures and different financial structures of student media. And we're hoping that at the end, we'll be able to have some really strong research-based best practices for student media to sort of determine how to best secure independence from the university.
My goodness, I could see that as being so incredibly helpful. So I look forward to seeing that when it comes out. That's great. We're running out of time. And so I just want to throw one more question at you. Unless there is anybody in the audience currently who wants to ask a question, and it's okay if you want to unmute and ask the question. Otherwise, I'm going to throw the last question at Lindsie. I'm going to give you a second if anybody wants to chime in. Okay, well then I'm going to ask the last question, and I want to shift a little bit to a key issue for student journalists right now, which is Title IX. Yeah, so talk to me, Lindsie, a little bit about how Title IX's mandatory reporting policies, especially when they're applied to student journalists, are ultimately giving us some challenges.
So I'm cognizant of the fact that I have, I think, 1 minute and 30 seconds, and this is an issue that I could talk about for hours.
Right? Go for it.
But yeah, I mean, so colleges, more and more colleges are saying all employees of our campus are mandatory reporters. And at many colleges, student journalists are paid by the institution and therefore may be considered to be an employee who would be required to report any instances of Title IX violations, so sexual assault, sexual harassment, that they find out about to their university, which obviously poses a huge problem if a student journalist is trying to cover sexual assault on campus and has a survivor who comes to them and wants to give them their story anonymously, which normally as journalists we would be able to do. But in these contexts, you can actually end up getting into trouble with the university, if you take these stories anonymously without reporting them. This is another one of those sort of 30% of the time nefarious, 70% of the time it's just not really thought about. So, FIRE, it's one of the things that I'm really working on right now is to work with campuses, work with student journalists to revise these policies to make an exception for student journalists, because there's really no reason that a student journalist should be a mandatory reporter under Title IX, because it not only takes away the journalist's ability to do their job and to cover these things, pseudonymous, I can't talk, with pseudonyms, but it also, really robs the survivor of the right to control how and when their story is told. So call me if you're subject to one of these policies, because it's definitely one of my other sort of high horses.
Yeah, and I would just add to that too, that sometimes you've got a problem with, maybe it's an administrator or a faculty member who is at the heart of some of these questions, right? And therein lies yet another huge dicey problem, right?
Yeah.
So I know we are out of time. I want to thank all of you for being here, and Lindsie, especially you. Thank you so much for your insights today. They were fantastic. And I do urge all of you, if you continue to have questions, with respect to student free press questions, student free speech questions, Lindsie truly is one of the nation's foremost experts in this area, and it's her job to answer your questions and to address these things. So please do check out student press on the FIRE website, thefire.org. And I think I want to thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This was really fun.
Yes.
It was really fun.
Yes, thanks to the both of you. Thanks to our participants out there. We really appreciate this enlightening conversation that needs to continue. But we are at the end of our time. So thank you to everyone. And I hope everyone has a really nice weekend.